Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus.
So Ephesians 3 verse 16 is the focus, but I'm going to back up to verse 14, at least to get to the beginning of the paragraph. I'd really need to back up. Well, if I backed up to chapter 3, then I'd have to back up to chapter 2, then I'd have to back up to chapter 1. So we can't get the whole context, but we will get the paragraph. For this reason, he says, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named, that according to the riches of his glory, he may grant to you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Now, I read that far because that's where the sentence ends. The focus is on that phrase, that he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit. We are strengthened by or through the Spirit. What does that mean? Okay. Facilitates, that's a good word. Yes, ma'am. You reading Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 16? That's okay. However, good teaching moment here, if that ever happens, and you say, wait a minute, this doesn't read the same as what you read, and I'm confused, please ask the question. Sometimes it's as simple as, oops, one of us is in the wrong place. Sometimes it is a translation difference, and then we can parse through it and determine whether or not there's really any substantive difference between it. More often than not, there will not be substantive difference, but occasionally there will be, and sometimes I find that one translation just in that place chooses words that at least are more effective, in my opinion, to convey the idea. And so I do have preferences sometimes for this translation in this verse over the other one. But anyway, let me ask it this way. We've talked about this through this whole entire study. And I'll just pose this as a question. How? How does the Spirit strengthen us?
We don't know. We learned that in the West.
That is the end. We don't know. And so is it left for us to start speculating? And the answer is no, we shouldn't do that. Now, if you want to do that for yourself, and as part of your study, and then continue to pour into the deeper parts of the scriptures and look at all different things and see if you can come to ascertain some knowledge, that's great. But Deuteronomy 29:29, the secret things belong to God. If he doesn't say anything about it, it's not ours to contemplate. It's not ours even to wrestle with. Because what the rest of Deuteronomy 29:29 is, but the things revealed belong to you and your children. Those are ours to wrestle with and understand. And as I like to tell folks, listen, I've got enough here trying to figure out what this means. I don't need to try to figure out what's not here. Because quite frankly, that's impossible. The other thing that I want to point out about this verse that is extremely important is notice that it says that he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit. By the way, it is with power. It is meaningful. But then he says, in your inner being. What is the inner being? Some translations may say inner man. Yeah.
To one's personality,
Okay.
one's consciousness.
It's spoken like a true psychologist. That's a good answer. He talks about this, the same writer, inspired to write to the church at Corinth, uses a similar language about the inner and the outer man. So now we've got this contrast. Okay, what's the outer man? Maybe that's easier for us to identify. What is the outer man? You got the flesh and blood part, the things that you can see and contact and have the ability to measure and study and determine. But the inner man is that part of man that is not seen, that's not material, that's not flesh and blood. It's the spirit or the soul of man. That thing that makes us unique. And that does have something to do with our consciousness, with our awareness, with our intellect, with our creativity, with all of those things that make humanity unique. That which is created in the image of God is what I would suggest. When you go back to Genesis 1, let us make man in our image. So when we think about these things, we have to understand that what this is talking about is not some kind of material strength. And it's not attending to the body. Do we have any examples of what this is talking about that we can turn to in the Bible and say, oh, this is what it's talking about? And my answer to that would be, we have some that we could raise, but we actually don't know that they're these. The mistake that a lot of people might make is say, well, Jesus was strengthened in the garden. Yeah, but was that through the Spirit? There was an angel sent to minister to him. Jesus was strengthened in the wilderness after his temptation too, but there was an angel that was sent to minister unto him. So it's not exactly the same thing. We're not talking about the same type of strengthening. In the garden, it was to strengthen him mentally and physically and all sorts of other different ways. This is something very different than that. This is an inner man thing. Now, do you have to, well, let me ask it this way. Have you ever been in a situation where you had life's difficulties challenging you, bringing you down, depressing you, whatever you want to say along those lines? And then you have a good friend that comes by, and sometimes the good friend does nothing but says a few words. And can you be strengthened by those words? Yeah, unfortunately, Job's friends weren't a lot of help to him, but that is the same concept. And that brings up a good side of this discussion that I never even dreamed about bringing into it, so I appreciate the comment. The content of the words can make a difference as to whether or not it's strengthening or it's not. It's helpful or it's not. I don't have any reason to believe that this is going to happen any differently than the message that the Spirit brought into the world, which is powerful. It's living and active and powerful, and it's able to discern to the degree that the Bible says it can even part between bone and marrow, between soul and spirit. Anybody want to offer me a dissertation about the distinction between the soul of man and the spirit of man? Neither do I. Because sometimes they are used essentially interchangeably, and other times they're used distinct from one another, and what makes them exactly distinct is really hard to tell. I just know that there are differences, that they are two distinct things. Yes, ma'am.
Between soul and spirit, the soul is us, and what we do in the spirit is what's been betrothed to us, and depends on if we're faithful and loyal or not.
Okay, but man has a spirit. Man is spirit, which is distinct from the spirit which is given to us. So we have to wrestle with all of these concepts and try to make some sense and understanding out of them, which is what we're trying to do in this class. What I'm trying to get us to understand is you don't have to separate the Word of God from the Spirit of God in order for the Spirit to strengthen you with power in the inner man. Sometimes it's me sitting down and reading what God has said and being strengthened by what I learn. How do I learn to overcome trials and difficulties in life? This strengthens me. Count it all joy when you incur various trials. Peter writes, don't be surprised at the fiery trial which is about to come upon you. Do those words help strengthen us and help us endure? Help us overcome? Absolutely. Do we have those words without the Spirit of God? Do they have power in life without the Spirit of God? No. So it's important for us to not mysticize this language. Another passage to consider in this discussion, go to Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. We're going to be looking at verse 13, but I'll back up again to get the beginning of the paragraph to verse 12. So then, brothers, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. So it's by the Spirit that we're able to, quote, put to death the deeds of the body. Well, the first thing we need to understand is, what is he talking about when he talks about the deeds of the body? Okay, in short order, it's sin. But it's possibly more focused than that. When he says the deeds of the body, he's talking about the desires that arise because we are flesh. And those things can get in the way of righteousness. It's hard to limit yourself. Paul talks about it in one place, and the way he explains it, he says, you may not always do the things that you please. There's a lot of things that we think make us feel good, make us happy, that the scriptures suggest to us are inappropriate. Fornication gratifies a desire of the body, but it's inappropriate. And God has set forth a way in which that can appropriately be addressed, right? 1 Corinthians 7, he says that because of fornication, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. That there is a way in which you can satisfy that desire in a lawful, limited, controlled, disciplined fashion, but that you're not allowed just to appease. Now, you can do that with any of the desires of the flesh. Comfort and ease, when it gets to the point that it's laziness, that's not good. hunger and thirst, when you become a glutton and a wine bibber. That's not good. But you have to eat to live, right? How do we get to the point that we know what the limits are, that we know how we ought to conduct ourselves, that we know when we should say no to our bodies? And that's in fact where Paul goes with this. He said he buffets his body and makes it his slave. In other words, he says the inner man is controlling the outer man rather than the outer man controlling the inner man. How do we know? How do we get to that point? Well, that's what he's talking about here. We're debtors not to the flesh. If we live according to the flesh, what happens to us spiritually? We die. If we just go around and live this life satisfying our own desires, doing anything that we want to do, we're separated from God. So if we live to the flesh, we die. But, he says, if you live according to the Spirit, you put to death the deeds of the body, and you live. What's it mean to live according to the Spirit? What's it mean to live by the Spirit? Okay, following God's will. How do we know God's will? All Scripture is inspired by God. Who is it inspired by? The Spirit of God. I will send you the Spirit of truth, and he will reveal unto you all things. If we live by the Spirit, then we'll put to death the deeds of the body, and we'll find life. Again, it doesn't have to be mystical, and it's not something that is outside of our own decision-making process. And that's where the problem comes in with a lot of this. When we start talking about it being by the Spirit, at that point, people immediately begin to think, well, that means it's not me. I don't have anything to do with it. That's not totally true. If you live by the law, you won't go into prison in most circumstances, assuming there's not corruption somewhere. Does living by the law mean that you don't control what you do? You don't make choices? No, and in fact, it requires that you control yourself and make choices. To live by the law means that you have to be aware of the law, and you have to make decisions that coincide with the law. Well, I would suggest that the same is true here. God isn't going to come into us and make us do the right thing. He's revealed unto us the right things through his Spirit, and he's ready and willing to guide and direct us. We're going to talk about that next, being led by the Spirit. But we have to cooperate. We have to live by the Spirit. That is, we have to listen to him. If you've had children, you understand this concept. You tell your children to do something, they either do it or they don't. They either do it by your instructions or they do it their own way. Now, did you notice where this conversation started? Let's see. So then, brothers, we are debtors not to the flesh to live according to the flesh, doing our own thing. If you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit, the contrast, if living by the flesh is appeasing my own desires, satisfying my own appetites, the contrast, living by the Spirit, means that I live according to the Spirit's desires rather than my own. And who's in control of my spirit? See, this is where it gets interesting.
Small s?
Yes, that's a small s. My spirit. Who's in control of my spirit? I should be. Now, we can be undisciplined and not control our spirit and just satisfy whatever the desires of the flesh are, but that's a mistake. we're told to not be that way, but instead to be self-controlled, right? That's the fruit of the Spirit, by the way. Being self-controlled is a fruit of the Spirit. It's part of what the Spirit bears through us, is being self-controlled. Not being Spirit-controlled in I can't use the word literal, but I don't know a better word to use, in a literal sense, but being Spirit-controlled in the figurative sense of what? Disciplining my mind, being trained by the Spirit, and determining that I'm going to walk with the Spirit and not carry out the desires of the flesh. It again is a cooperative effort. Could I do it without the Spirit of God? No. We wouldn't even know what to do. I can't do it without the Spirit of God, but it also can't be done without my participation. I have to be engaged. I have to be self-disciplined. I have to say, this is what I will do. And then occasionally we fail. And what does that cause? Or what should that cause? Maybe that's a better word. Sorrow, regret, grief, repentance. That's what it should cause. If I am really desiring to limit myself to living according to the Spirit, when I don't do that, I'm disappointed in myself. By the way, I'm disappointed in myself. When the first reaction I have is to blame someone else for what I've done, I still have a problem. The first reaction should be to what? To own my responsibility, regardless of the circumstances. Even if it is all Greg's fault, I still say, you know what? I should not have done that. I should have known better. I should have listened to God and not him. It's when I have that attitude that I start realizing that I am seeking to live by the Spirit and not carry out the desires of the flesh. And so that's what we're talking about in terms of being strengthened by the Spirit and being able to put to death the deeds of the body by the Spirit. It's the aid, the strength, the comfort, the direction, the understanding that comes from the Spirit of God and the work of the Spirit of God that even puts me in the position of trying. Because I'm telling you, when you're 2 years old, that's not how you live. When you're 2 years old, you do not say, okay, what would God have me to do? When you're 2 years old, you say, I want it and I want it now. And if you have it, I'm going to take it. But when we are trained and taught and mature, that's where Paul gets to the, you may not always do what you please. You know that famous passage where he talks about that inner struggle within us, where he wants to do what's right, but his body's fighting against him. And he finally draws that conclusion. You just cannot do the things that you please. You have to discipline yourself. I would be in no position to discipline myself without the work of the Spirit. If the Spirit had never moved in the world, if the Spirit had never worked, if the Spirit had never done anything, you know what we would all walk around like 2-year-olds. And unfortunately for some of us who are not bigger and stronger, we would always be on the losing end of things. Unless we got smarter and figured out ways to do it around the brute strength. But that's not how we're supposed to live. To be strengthened by the Spirit, to be able to put to death those things, to me is to say we're taught. by the Spirit, just like children are taught by their parents. And, great illustration, didn't know I was going to be able to write it this long. Even if you, as a parent, teach your children and they learn and they listen to you and they do what's right, there's a day coming where they may do what? They may quit listening and do what they want to do. And whose fault is that? That's their fault. That's their choice. Boy, that's a hard thing to come to grips with as the teacher. But listen, when I sin, it ain't God's fault. It's my fault. When I sin, it's not even the devil's fault, even though he's potentially enticed me to sin. Not his fault. I'm the one that looked. I'm the one that took. I'm the one that bit. For those of you that hadn't picked up yet, I'm referring back to the temptation in the Garden of Eden. It was Eve that looked at the apple and saw that it was good for food. It was a delight to the eyes, and it was desirable to make one wise. And she took and ate. Now, that doesn't mean that Satan hadn't done something wrong. He has. But her culpability was on her. Her guilt. And until she realized that, then she was in trouble. Go ahead. Yes. And I like to use the word discipline because people misunderstand the word punish. They were disciplined by God. There were disciplines put in place. By the way, we also live under some of those very disciplines. Still to this day. And we ought to be learning the same lessons from them that they were designed to teach them. Which goes all the way back to, it's teaching us to listen to God and do what he says. And when he says, this isn't good, even though it looks good to you, he means what he says. And that's a hard thing to do as a parent too, to sit back and let the natural consequences of children's behavior pay their dividends. Very hard to do. It is extremely a balancing act. And the longer I've done it, the more I realize I'm not good at it. Or I'm not nearly as good at it as I thought I was. When I started, I thought I was really good at it. The longer I've lived, the more I've learned, I wasn't nearly as good as I thought I was. We're strengthened by the Spirit. Can't deny that. We're able to put to death the deeds of the body because of the Spirit. Can't deny that. If you start thinking that you can do it on your own, you're in trouble. You cannot. That's the meaning of, therefore, let he who thinks he stands take heed, lest he falls. When I start thinking, hey, I got this figured out, I understand all this, I can do this, that is the beginning of my failure. Because I can't. Look down in verse 26, particularly the first part of verse 26. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weaknesses, or in our weakness. Again, don't need to make this mystical. No need for that. He helps us in our weakness the same way that our spouse helps us in our weakness, the same way that our children help us in our weakness, the same way that our extended family, the same way that our brethren help us in our weakness. We're to bear one another's burdens. That's helping us in our weakness. Does that mean if I bear your burdens, does that mean that I take them all away from you No, what's it mean? I help you in your weakness. I help you bear up under them. I don't take it from you and do it for you. I help. And sometimes it's just standing on the sidelines cheering. I just saw a video on, I think it was Facebook, a friend of mine shared. He was running a long race, and his little girl was standing in the crowd. And I forget at what mile he was in this race, but he's tired at this point, and he's trudging along as he runs by. And his little girl, who was about 4 years old, says, "Run faster, Daddy." That's helping in his weakness. That was encouragement, even though it may not have been taken that way at the time. That's part of it. The cheering crowd at the sporting event is supporting the players on the field. They're not out there doing the game for them, but they're encouraging them. If you don't think it makes a difference, go to Kyle Stadium sometime, watch a football game. You know what they call the crowd at Kyle Stadium or at Texas A&M University? The 12th man. You want to know why? Because they have an impact on the field. Sometimes the only help we need is the encouragement of the Scriptures. Sometimes that's all I know what to say.
The value of attending the assembly, because you need social interaction with your brothers and sisters who can share what they've learned from their experiences with you to may help you solve your own.
Absolutely. And that's how we stimulate one another to love and good deeds. That is being strengthened by your brethren, which, by the way, we're told to do that. We're told to strengthen one another, are we not? Well, the Spirit does that as well. He is an instrumental agent by which the strength and support that we need in this world comes from God. Do I understand all of the ins and outs of it? Absolutely not. I probably can't understand all the ins and outs of it. You can't deny that it happens because you don't understand it all. But you also can't make up ways simply because they seem good to you. I think we need to be careful about this. And again, look at all these things. They're very direct and clear statements about what is. None of them get into the particulars of the how. In order to ascertain the how, I think you have to look at the balance of everything that's revealed. Which, by the way, is why it's important that we read and study the entirety of the Scriptures and consider all that God has said. And it is when we have that general knowledge of the Scriptures that we read things like this and we go, oh, okay, I understand that means that God is on my side and God is trying to help me, which means that when God says, avoid this and hold on to this, that is his strengthening advice. You read, and I'm gonna pick the wrong one. I think it's in Proverbs, almost certain it's in Proverbs, where he talks about the adulterous woman who lives on the street, and what he essentially says is, look, just don't go down that street. You know what he's saying there? He's simply saying, avoid the temptation. You know the temptation's out there, so don't look at it, don't go to it, don't put yourself in that situation. Avoid the situation altogether and find a better circumstance. That's the advice of God. Great advice. It's the difference between succeeding and failing and putting to death the deeds of the body. We're led by the Spirit. Romans 8:14. Back a few verses from where we were just reading in verse 26. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. All right, there's a couple ways we can break this down, all of which I think are healthy. How do I know I'm a son of God? I'm led by the Spirit. That's what this says. All who are led by the Spirit are sons of God. We can identify the sons of God by looking at people who are led by the Spirit. How do I know if someone's led by the Spirit? By their works, by their fruit, and we have a list of what the fruit of the Spirit is. So the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, self-control, etc. You see those things in someone's life, you say that person is being led by the Spirit, because listen, that's not where we go on our own. Where we go on our own is selfishness, selfish ambition, getting for ourselves, advantaging ourselves. That's where we go on our own. To say it nicely, take care of number one. You know who number one always is in our minds? Me. Okay, this guy is selfish, and he's divisive, and he's harsh, not being led by the Spirit. Therefore, not a son of God. This person is full of love and joy and peace, and they're patient. They seek unity. They seek to strengthen and edify. Those are all fruits of the Spirit. That person's being led by the Spirit. That person's a son of God. Led by the Spirit doesn't mean that the Spirit takes us by the nose and drags us where we don't want to go. In fact, the imagery that's always used by God, is that of a shepherd. Why? Why does he use that imagery? Because shepherds don't drag people where they don't want to go. Shepherds lead them. And the flock voluntarily follows because they know that the shepherd is leading them to green pastures. The contrast is with the fellow who has to prod, poke, kick, and drive some other thing to a place it doesn't want to go. It's not the Lord is my cowboy. It's the Lord is my shepherd. There's a reason for that. I got to stop this morning. I don't want to, but I have to. We're led by the Spirit. We're going to look at Galatians 5 in connection with that, and then move right from there into the fruit of the Spirit discussion more fully, and then we'll be finished with this section. Appreciate your presence and your participation this morning.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout